Nora Briggs was 21 years old and had 40 acres and a plan that everyone in Hardin County thought was wrong when she walked into the co-op that Tuesday morning in September of 1988. Boyd Harker set the order form face down on the counter without reading it. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he finds mildly amusing. Then he looked at the three farmers sitting in the metal folding chairs along the wall: Buck Alderman, Walt Pruitt, Gus Mercer, men who had been coming to that co-op since before Nora was born. Boyd looked back at her. "Honey," he said, and he said it the way that word is always said when it means something other than what it says. "This is corn country. Has been since before your grandfather broke the first sod." Nora picked up the order form, folded it once, and put it in her jacket pocket. "I know what it has been," she said. "I am here about what it is going to be." She walked out. The bell above the door rang once. In the silence that followed, Buck Alderman shifted in his chair and Walt Pruitt looked at the ceiling, and Boyd Harker picked up his coffee mug and said, "Well, she will learn." Gus Mercer did not say anything. He watched the window until her truck pulled out of the gravel lot and disappeared down the county road. He had known Earl Briggs for 31 years. He had known Nora since she was 7, riding on the fender of her father's tractor because there was no room in the cab. He did not think she would learn the lesson Boyd Harker had in mind for her. He thought she might teach one instead. Let me tell you about Hardin County in 1988, because you need to understand the world Nora Briggs was walking into before you can understand what she was walking out of. Hardin County grew corn, not as a decision, not as a policy, as a fact of the earth itself. The way water runs downhill, and clay holds cold in the low places in the sky over central Iowa in late August, turns that particular shade of blue that belongs only to a place where the soil is deep and dark and has been feeding things since before any road was laid down. The farmers planted in May and harvested in October and sold to the elevator in Iowa Falls and started again. That was the rhythm. That was the year. Nobody had voted on it. Nobody had written it down. It was simply what Hardin County did, the way a river follows the slope it was given. The Briggs family had been on the same 620 acres in Hardin County since 1901. Earl's grandfather, a man named Thomas Briggs, had broken the original sod with a team of draft horses and a cast iron plow. Thomas built the house. His son built the machine shed. Earl's father put in the drainage tile on the east side that still worked perfectly after 40 years. And Earl had farmed every one of those 620 acres for 31 years with the methodical consistency he brought to everything in his life. Earl Briggs was not a man who wasted words or movement. He planted corn on 580 acres and soybeans on the remaining 40 in a rotation his father had taught him. He kept his records in a ledger on the shelf above the desk in the farm office. He kept his equipment clean and his fences tight, and his accounts paid on time. He had never borrowed more than he could repay within 18 months. He did not complain about prices or weather or government programs because complaining was, in his view, a form of wasted energy, and Earl Briggs did not waste energy. His wife May understood him the way a person understands a place they have lived in for a very long time. She knew which silences meant he was thinking and which meant he had already decided. She knew that when he said, "I will sleep on it," he had already made up his mind and needed one night to be certain it was right. She had been married to this man for 28 years. She could read him the way he read the soil, not by looking at the surface, but by knowing what lay underneath. Their daughter was different from the first day she could hold a pencil. Nora was the second of their 2 children. Her older brother Dale had taken a job with a farm equipment dealer in Des Moines the year before. Nora had gone to Iowa State University in Ames in the fall of 1986 with a canvas backpack and a composition notebook bought at the drugstore in Iowa Falls, and she had studied agronomy under a professor named Dr. Calvin Rourke, who had spent 27 years studying small grain production systems across the northern plains. On the first day of class, Rourke wrote a sentence on the blackboard. Nora copied it into her notebook and underlined it twice. The The most dangerous thing in farming is not drought or blight or price collapse. It is the assumption that what worked yesterday will work tomorrow. She came back to the farm in the summer of 1988 with 4 more notebooks, a head full of questions, and something her father recognized but could not have named. It was the look of a person who had found a real problem and intended to solve it. She was not a talker. She had grown up on that farm, and she knew how to drive a tractor and pull a calf and weld a broken bracket in a cold field at dusk. Her hands were not soft, but she also knew things that most of the men in Hardin County did not know, because she had spent 2 years reading everything Rourke put in front of her and then going looking for more. What she had found was this. The southwest corner of the Briggs farm was 40 acres of the worst ground on the property. Heavy clay content, poor drainage, the kind of soil that stayed wet in May when everything else had dried out enough to work, and baked into cracked plates in August when corn needed moisture most. For 5 consecutive years, that ground had yielded an average of 114 bushels of corn per acre, while the rest of the farm ran at 161. Earl knew it underperformed. He had added drainage tile, adjusted his fertilizer program, changed his hybrid selection twice. Nothing moved the number by more than 4 bushels. What Nora knew, and what she had spent the better part of 2 years calculating, was that winter wheat did not care about May drainage. Winter wheat was planted in September and germinated before the ground froze. It went dormant under snow. In spring, it broke dormancy weeks before the corn planting window opened, and it was harvested in early July, leaving the field clear. Its root system reached 4 to 6 feet into the soil profile, pulling moisture from depths that corn never touched. In a dry summer, that depth was the difference between a crop that survived and one that did not. In a year with a late frost, winter wheat at its tillering stage could tolerate temperatures that would kill emerged corn outright. She had the extension data from Iowa State. She had yield trials from research stations in southern Minnesota and northern Missouri. She had price history going back to 1965. She had calculated the seed cost, the equipment modification needed for the grain drill she planned to borrow from Gus Mercer, the expected yield range across 3 different scenarios, and the expected per acre revenue in each scenario compared against what that specific 40 acres had done on corn for 5 years running. In every scenario, including the pessimistic one, the 40 acres of winter wheat outperformed the same 40 acres of corn by between $14 and $38 per acre. She brought the proposal to the kitchen table on a Thursday evening in August of 1988. She laid the papers out in order: the yield comparison, the price history, the soil profile analysis, the map showing exactly which 40 acres she meant and why that ground specifically. The kitchen went quiet. May stopped wiping the counter. Earl set down his coffee cup. He picked up the revenue comparison sheet and read it with the full weight of his attention, the way he gave every document that might cost him money or make him some. He set it down. He picked up the yield trial data from Minnesota. He read that too. He set it down and looked at the map. "I need to think about it," he said. May waited until Earl had gone to the shop. Then she sat across from Nora at the same table and looked at the papers laid between them. "He will say yes," May said quietly. "Just give him 2 days." What Nora did not know then, and would not know for a very long time, was that something had already happened before she walked through that door with her papers. 3 weeks earlier, before Nora had finished assembling the proposal, May had walked past the farm office and seen the notebooks open on the desk. She had stood in the doorway and read what she could see from there. Then she had gone to the kitchen, sat down, and written something in careful handwriting on the first page of the composition notebook Nora had left on the desk. She wrote it and left it where it would be found, though she said nothing about it to anyone. Earl came in for breakfast 2 mornings after the kitchen table conversation. He sat down, poured his coffee, and said to Nora without preamble, "Plant your 40 acres. We will see how it goes." He did not say he believed in it. He did not say she was right. He gave her the ground. In Hardin County, Iowa, giving someone the ground was the most serious form of permission there was. Now let me tell you about a man named Dalton Vance, because he is part of this story from the beginning. Even though Nora did not know his name yet, Dalton Vance was 38 years old in the fall of 1988. He wore pressed khaki trousers and leather shoes built for office floors, not gravel lots. He carried a briefcase that had never held a soil sample. He worked for a company called Agricor Agricultural Solutions, headquartered in Chicago, which had been expanding aggressively into the Iowa corn market through a program that offered farmers exclusive seed supply contracts. The terms were simple. Agricor provided proprietary hybrid corn seed at a locked price and a preferred buyer arrangement with 2 regional grain elevators. In return, the farmer agreed to purchase exclusively from Agricor for 5 years and to plant no competing grain crops on any contracted acre. Agricor's strategy was to lock in the large farms first. In Hardin County, the Briggs operation was the second largest. Vance had already signed 9 farms in the county when he pulled into the Briggs driveway on a Wednesday afternoon in late September, 3 weeks after Nora had put her winter wheat seed in the ground. Earl was in the shop. He listened to the full presentation without interrupting. "We plant a rotation on this farm," Earl said when Vance finished. "What you are describing would end that." Vance said rotational flexibility could be discussed. Earl said he would not sign anything that limited what his daughter planted on this ground. Vance said the offer remained open and drove away. He sat in the truck for a moment with the engine running, looking at the machine shed and the grain bins and the long flat fields toward the county road. He wrote something in a small notebook, capped his pen, and left. Earl described the visit that evening at dinner, accurately and without editorializing. Nora had already read about Agricor's expansion strategy in an agricultural trade publication at the Iowa State Library. She knew what the exclusive planting clause meant. "We cannot sign that," she said. Earl said, "I know." That was the end of the conversation. Nora planted her winter wheat in the 3rd week of September 1988. She spent an afternoon calibrating Gus Mercer's borrowed grain drill in the driveway with a catch tray and a scale, getting the seeding rate to exactly 1.4 million seeds per acre. She drilled at 3/4-inch depth. The variety was a soft red winter wheat, with documented cold hardiness ratings tested in northern Iowa extension trials since 1974. Chosen after reading 4 separate trial reports and comparing winter kill rates across 3 years of data. The ground was dry enough to work and warm enough to germinate. Within 11 days, she had a stand. Thin green lines running in rows across the 40 acres, looking like nothing that had ever grown on that corner of the farm. People on the county road slowed down when they passed. Walt Pruitt called Earl and asked if there had been a planting error. Earl said no and offered nothing further. Buck Alderman told 3 people at the co-op that Earl Briggs had let his college girl plant something in the Southwest 40 that looked like it belonged in Kansas. Boyd Harker heard about it the same afternoon. None of them drove out to ask Nora what she was doing or why. She walked the field every 3 days with a notebook dedicated entirely to field records. Date, plant count per square foot, growth stage, soil temperature at 2-inch depth, presence or absence of disease pressure. She was building something with those records. Not because anyone asked her to, but because she understood that proof required documentation, and documentation required time, and she had both. By the time the ground froze in November, the wheat had reached the 4-leaf stage and gone into dormancy looking healthy and thick, exactly as the extension literature said it should. Nora photographed it with a disposable camera and wrote the date and growth stage on the back of each print, tucking them into an envelope inside the notebook. The winter of 1988 into 1989 was long and cold. 14 inches of snow covered that field from January through the 2nd week of March. When the snow pulled back, the wheat was still there, still green, dormant, but alive, carrying in its cells the particular resilience of a plant bred over centuries to survive exactly this. That was when Nora decided to burn. She made that decision for a reason that most people watching from the county road never thought to ask about. Winter wheat coming out of dormancy in early spring accumulates dead leaf tissue from the previous fall. That dry, papery material harbors fungal spores, particularly a disease called septoria leaf blotch, which moves upward into new growth as the plant resumes. A controlled burn of dormant wheat in early spring before active growth resumes. When the crown of the plant sits safely below the soil surface, removes the dead tissue, and releases a pulse of nitrogen and potassium from the ash that feeds the plant as it wakes. It was practiced in parts of Kansas and Nebraska. It was documented in extension literature from Kansas State University. It was not new. It was, however, new in Hardin County. Nora chose a morning in late March when the wind was calm and the soil moist enough to keep the fire manageable. She carried a backpack sprayer full of water. Earl stood at the field edge with a wet burlap sack, the same kind his father had used for a dozen different purposes over the decades. She lit the windward edge at 7:14 in the morning and walked the fire across at a pace that let the dead material burn clean without dwelling long enough to reach the crowns an inch below the surface. By 7:54 it was done. The field was black and smelled of char. Nora had dug test points in 3 locations before lighting anything, confirmed the crown depth, and marked them with wire flags. She checked them now. The crowns were undamaged. Earl walked the burn line with her. He looked at the black ground and the wire flags and the test holes. Then he looked at her for a moment and turned and walked back toward the house without speaking. The calls started before she reached the door. The first was from Roy Phelps, who farmed the section to the east and had seen the smoke and thought something had gone wrong. The second was a relay from Boyd Harker, who had heard about the burn within the hour. Harker's message was that he hoped she had not just killed her crop. Earl answered both calls. He said the same thing to both of them. She knows what she is doing. He said it without inflection. The way he stated things he had decided were true. That was the whole of his certainty, and it held the way a properly set post holds, not because of volume, but because of depth. May told Nora what Earl had said, quietly, at the sink that afternoon. Nora did not respond. She went to the farm office and opened the notebook. Burn completed. Crowns undamaged. March 28th, 1989. Temperature at burn time 44 degrees. Wind 3 miles per hour from the northwest. Duration 40 minutes. She wrote it with the precision of someone who understood that facts were the only argument that lasted. The wheat came back in April. It broke dormancy in the second week, right on schedule, and it came up clean and green without the gray-brown spotting that septoria produces on unburned fields. Nora walked it every 3 days. She noted the tiller count and leaf color and growth stage in centimeters and the absence of disease. The field moved differently in the wind than any other field in the county, in long, slow waves, the way small grain crops do, and it looked as though it had always belonged there. Corn planting across the rest of the Briggs farm began in early May. Earl was in the planter cab 12 hours a day. The Southwest 40 was already 18 inches tall and heading toward joint by the time corn went in on the rest of the property. And then Dalton Vance came back. He arrived on a Friday afternoon in late April 1989 without an appointment. May answered the door. She told him Earl was in the field and she could take a message. Vance said he was not there for Earl. He said he had something for the family to consider and preferred to leave it in writing. He handed May an envelope, thanked her, and drove away. His shoes were still wrong for a gravel lot. The envelope contained a letter from AgriCorps' legal office. It stated that AgriCorps had acquired from Hardin County Savings Bank the outstanding note on a property improvement loan the Briggs farm had taken in 1983 to fund a drainage tile installation on the east acreage. The original loan had been for $62,000. The outstanding balance was $41,400. AgriCorps, as the new holder, was exercising its right to call the full balance due within 90 days. The letter was dated April 19th, 1989. At the bottom, below the legal language and the signatures, a handwritten note in the margin read, "We remain interested in a partnership that would satisfy this obligation in full." May read the letter at the kitchen table. She read it twice. Then she put it back in the envelope and set it on the farm office desk and returned to what she had been doing. She had grown up the daughter of a Depression-era farmer and had married a farmer through the hard years of the 70s. She had watched more than one family lose a farm to a piece of paper. She knew what a piece of paper could do. She also knew what another kind of paper could do. She went to the storage room at the back of the house. Behind a stack of metal milk crates on the bottom shelf, crates that had been there since Earl's father's time, sat a tin box, not large, the kind that had once held shortbread cookies and been repurposed because the lid fit and the seal held. May had known about that box since the first winter after her marriage. Earl's mother had shown her where it lived and told her what was inside and said, "You will know when it matters." May carried the box to the kitchen table. She set it next to the Agricor envelope and waited for Earl to come in from the field. Earl read the letter standing at the counter with his boots still on. He read it once, set it flat on the counter, and looked at it without touching it for a long time. Then he opened the tin box and sorted through the documents inside. A folder of stiff brown paper holding papers he had not examined in years. About 4 minutes in, he found what the situation called for. He held it up to the kitchen light. The original property deed from 1923, when Thomas Briggs had paid $4,200 for the first 200 acres of what would become this farm. The paper had gone the color of old honey. The language was dense and formal, but in the section governing land use restrictions, a county recorder who had understood that farmland transfers required specificity had written a clause. It stated that the property and any subsequent additions to the tract could not be subjected to exclusive agricultural production contracts with any third-party commercial entity without the written consent of the deed-holding family. The restriction had been placed at the insistence of the original seller, a farmer named Elias Trowbridge, who had sold because he was moving but refused to sell to anyone who would lock the land into a single company arrangement. The clause had been attached to the deed through every subsequent addition to the property. It covered all 620 acres. Earl set the deed down on the counter next to the Agricor letter. He looked at both pieces of paper. Then he looked at May. She was already writing down the phone number of Frank Calhoun, the farm attorney in Iowa Falls. Outside the kitchen window, in the southwest 40, Nora's wheat stood 20 inches tall and clean as a new page. She did not know about any of this yet. She was kneeling at the field edge with her notebook, recording the tiller count per plant and the growth stage to the centimeter. Building the record she had always known was the only argument worth making. 21 years old, writing things down in a field that everyone in the county had laughed at. The wheat stood around her. Across the road, Walt Pruitt's fields lay bare and dark with fresh-turned soil. 60 days from now, they would both face the same sky. Only one of them was ready for what it was about to do. Earl called Frank Calhoun the next morning. He did not describe the situation in detail on the phone. He said he had a document he needed someone to read, and he needed to know what it meant. Calhoun said, "Come Tuesday." Earl drove to Iowa Falls on Tuesday with the deed and the Agricor letter, and sat across from Calhoun in a chair that had probably held 100 farmers before him. Men who had come with envelopes they did not fully understand. He waited while the attorney read both documents twice. Calhoun took off his reading glasses. He said, "Where did you keep this deed?" "In a tin box," Earl said. "Under the shelf in the storage room." "How long has it been there?" "Since before I owned the farm. My mother showed my wife where it was." Calhoun looked at the deed again. He said the restriction clause was enforceable, that it ran with the land and had attached to every parcel added to the original tract. Agricor could not compel a signature on an exclusive production contract. If they attempted to foreclose on the note as leverage, the deed was the defense. He said he would write a letter. He asked for 3 days. Earl drove home on the county road with the radio off. He passed the co-op and the elevator and the turnoff for Gus Mercer's place, and then he passed his own turnoff and stopped and backed up and pulled in. He sat in the truck in front of the machine shed looking at the southwest field through the windshield. The wheat was 22 inches tall. It was the 11th of May, 1989. The sky to the north had been doing something unusual since before dawn. He got out and stood at the field edge and looked north. What happened next did not announce itself. It came the way the worst things come to farming country, quietly, at night, while people slept in houses that were already cold. The temperature in Hardin County on the morning of May 11th fell to 23 degrees Fahrenheit. It had dropped 14 degrees in 6 hours. An Arctic air mass had moved south out of Manitoba faster than the forecast indicated, and by the time the first farmers stepped outside at first light, the damage across 4 counties was complete. Nora woke at 4:40 to a silence she recognized, the particular held-breath silence of a cold that has settled hard and stopped moving. She was dressed and outside before 5 with a flashlight and her notebook, and she walked the southwest 41st. The wheat had not changed. Same height as the evening before, same color, standing in the flashlight beam as though the temperature were still 50 degrees instead of 23. This was not luck. Winter wheat at the jointing stage carries its growing point below the soil surface and handles ice formation at the cellular level differently than corn tissue. She had calculated the probability of a late frost in May in Hardin County using 38 years of weather records from the Iowa State Climatological Archive. She had known this was possible. She had chosen this crop for this ground in part because of that knowledge. She walked the field for 20 minutes. She dug 3 test holes with a hand probe and checked the crowns. Undamaged. She wrote it all down. Then she walked to the fence line at the edge of Walt Pruitt's property and turned her flashlight east. Walt had planted in the first week of May. Same as always. Same as most of Hardin County. The corn had been up for 8 days. The seedlings had been 3 to 4 inches tall the afternoon before. In the flashlight beam, they lay flat against the soil, water-soaked, collapsed at the line where cold had found them. The growing point in young corn rises above ground within days of emergence. By the 8th day, it had risen far enough that 23 degrees had taken it. Nora stood at that fence line without writing anything. This was not a moment that required documentation. She turned off the flashlight and stood in the dark and let what she was seeing settle into her. She walked back to the house as the sky began to lighten. May was at the stove. Nora poured coffee and sat at the kitchen table. 20 minutes later, Earl came in from his own walk. He sat across from her. May set a plate on the table. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Earl said, "How is the wheat?" Nora said, "Clean." He nodded once. He said, "I lost about 55 acres on the low ground." She did not offer consolation, and she did not say anything that began with, "I told you." The low ground was the ground that held cold air drained from higher elevations. She had mapped those acres in her second notebook 2 years ago when she was building the case for the Southwest 40. She had not mentioned it to Earl because there had been no reason to then. He knew it now in a way that no map could have given him. Outside, the damage across the county was becoming visible. Cold damage does not announce itself in fire or flood. It shows itself in stillness, in the absence of movement in plants that should be standing. 60 miles of flat Iowa farmland with corn lying down in 1,000 fields, and the phones were starting. Gus Mercer called at 7:15. His voice was steady. He had lost 40 acres on his east side, corn planted 10 days ago. He asked how Earl had come through. Earl told him about the 55 acres. Then he said, "The wheat is fine." Gus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have asked her 2 years ago what she knew." Earl said, "You can ask her now. She is right here." Nora took the phone. She and Gus talked for 11 minutes. She gave him the variety name, the seeding rate, the source for the extension data. She offered to send the yield trial reports from the Minnesota stations. She did not say "I told you so" because she was not built for that. She said, "The frost window in May is real, and it has always been real. We just stopped accounting for it because we had a long run without one." Gus said he needed to think about it. Nora said, "I have notebooks. Come whenever you want." She handed the phone back to Earl and went to the farm office. Roy Phelps called. Walt Pruitt called. Not to talk about wheat, just to say it had been a hard morning the way neighbors do when there is nothing practical left to offer. Boyd Harker did not call. Nora recorded that fact in her notebook without comment and moved on. The harvest came in early July. She had arranged for Clyde Ramsey to bring his combine from 2 counties south, a custom cutter who had run wheat in the Nebraska Panhandle. Clyde arrived on a Tuesday morning pulling a grain cart behind a truck that had seen better years but ran with the reliability of equipment maintained by someone who understood it. He got out, walked to the field edge, picked up a wheat head, rubbed it between his palms, and looked at what came out. "Good stand," he said, and meant it. They started cutting at 7:30. The morning ran well. The combine steady. The grain cart filling at the rate Nora had estimated in the notebook. Until the machine stopped at 40 minutes past 10. Not a gradual slowdown, a full stop. The header had jammed. The feeder house auger had encountered a condition it was not configured for. Wheat straw differs from corn residue in ways that matter to a machine, and Clyde's header settings needed adjustment for the specific variety and straw length she was growing. Clyde climbed down and assessed the problem. He needed a specific slip clutch spring. His were worn. The part would mean a 3-hour round trip to the dealer in Iowa Falls if they had it. Nora looked at the sky. Weather was building in the northwest, not immediately dangerous, but moving in a direction she did not like. 5 to 6 hours before she needed to be concerned. She thought about who in the county would have that part. She thought about it for about 30 seconds. Then she got in the truck and drove to the Hardin County Co-op. Boyd Harker was behind the counter on a quiet Tuesday morning in July. He looked up when Nora came in. He did not smile. He did not turn away. He waited. She named the part, the make, the model year, the specific component. Reading from the description she had written word for word in her notebook on the drive over. Boyd went to the parts room and came back in 4 minutes with a paper bag. He set it on the counter and named the price. She counted out the cash. She was almost to the door when Boyd said, "How is the stand?" She turned around. He was looking at the counter, hands flat on the surface. Something in his face had settled into stillness. She said, 58 bushels to the acre on ground that was doing 114 on corn. He did not respond. She said, "I will have the yield ticket from the elevator by Friday. You can see the actual number." She drove back to the field. Clyde had the header apart by the time she arrived and replaced the spring in 18 minutes. The combine started again. They finished the 40 acres by 3 in the afternoon, ahead of the weather by a margin Nora recorded in her notebook as adequate. The yield ticket from the Iowa Falls elevator read 57.8 bushels per acre, $3.41 per bushel. She did the math in the truck. $197.12 per acre in gross revenue. The same 40 acres had averaged $141 per acre in corn revenue the previous 3 years. With frost damage factored into the rest of the farm that season, the comparison was not close. She drove home, clipped the yield ticket to the inside back cover of the field notebook, and set it on the desk. Earl looked at the number that evening. He set the ticket down and picked up the farm map, the one with the original 40 acres marked and 2 other parcels outlined in pencil, the North 80 and the creek bottom ground. He put his finger on the North 80. "What would you do with this?" he said. She had a notebook page ready for that question. She had written it in February, when the wheat was dormant under snow and the evenings were long. She opened to that page and set the notebook on the table. He read it. He said, "And the creek bottom." She turned to the next page. That was the beginning of the second year. Before the second year could begin, Calhoun's letter reached Agricorp's legal office in Chicago. Earl described the contents to Nora that same evening, after she closed the notebook. He told her about the deed and the restriction clause and what Calhoun had said. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You have had that deed since before I was born," she said. "My mother kept it." Earl said, "May knew where it was." Nora thought about that. She thought about May reading the Agricorp letter twice without panic and going directly to the storage room. She thought about how many times in her life she had watched her mother do something quietly and precisely that no one else in the room had noticed until long after. "Did May tell you to get the box?" Nora said. Earl looked at her. "She told me it was time to look at what was in it." Nora nodded. She wrote in the notebook that evening. Not the legal details, but this May knew. She always knew. Agricorp's response arrived 12 days after Calhoun's letter. Their legal team had reviewed the deed. They did not contest the restriction clause. They did not pursue the note. The balance of $41,400 was returned to Hardin County Savings Bank, and the bank sent Earl a letter confirming the original payment terms were restored. Dalton Vance did not come back to the Briggs farm. He did return to 9 other farms in the county that summer, farms that had signed the Agricorp contract the year before. 3 of those operations had lost significant corn acres to the May frost. They were now in the second year of a 5-year exclusive planting agreement with a company that still required them to plant the same hybrid corn on the same low ground that had just frozen. They could not diversify without breaching the contract. The penalty clause for breach was large enough that 2 of the 3 could not afford to pay it. Nora learned pieces of this from Gus Mercer over the following months, and more of it in the following years, the way a county's private troubles become known to people who are paying attention and say little. What she knew in the summer of 1989 was this: she had a yield ticket, a deed that had held a field of wheat stubble drying in July heat, and 2 more parcels she wanted to put into rotation. She planted 120 acres of winter wheat in September of 1989, the Southwest 40 again, and the North 80 that Earl had put his finger on. She adjusted the seeding rate slightly from what she had learned in the first year's stand count, drilled at the same depth, same pace. The neighbors watched from the road with somewhat fewer pauses than the year before. The fall of 1989 passed into winter, and the wheat went dormant and came back in spring. She burned again in March of 1990, working the North 80 alone because Earl had pulled something in his shoulder. She walked the fire across 120 acres in an hour and 40 minutes, checked crowns at 12 test points, found all of them intact, and wrote it down. Then 1990 was a drought year. Central Iowa produces that kind of summer once a decade or so, the kind where subsoil moisture gives out in late June and corn begins to roll its leaves before noon in the first week of July. Earl's corn on the remaining acres of the farm suffered. The fields on lighter soil were hit hardest. At harvest, the numbers were the worst he had seen in 12 years. The wheat had come off in early July, before the worst of the summer heat. 61 bushels per acre on the Southwest 40, 58 on the North 80. The root systems had been drawing moisture from 4 feet down since March. The drought that stalled the corn in the top 18 inches of soil had barely touched the crop already sitting in the bin. Earl looked at both sets of numbers in October, the wheat from July and the corn from September, and said nothing for a long time. Nora sat across the table and waited. May was in the kitchen. The farm office was quiet, in the way it is quiet when a man is doing arithmetic that changes something. Earl said, "What is your plan for the creek bottom ground?" She opened the notebook to the page she had written in March, prepared because she had known this question was coming. She had known that patience with Earl Briggs meant having the answer ready before he finished deciding he wanted to ask it. The creek bottom was 40 acres that flooded in wet years and baked in dry ones and had averaged 109 bushels of corn per acre over 7 years. the worst performing ground on the farm. It also had the deepest topsoil and the highest organic matter, if you could manage the moisture, in the rotation she was proposing. The creek bottom would carry winter wheat in alternating years, giving the soil structure time to improve between corn cycles. By her projection, based on extension data from comparable ground in Benton County, the organic matter improvement over 5 years would lift the corn yield on that parcel by 15 to 20 bushels per acre. She did not present it as a theory. The numbers were there on the page. Earl read it. He folded his hands on the table. He said, "Plant it." That was October 1990. By spring of 1991, 160 acres of the Briggs farm were in the winter wheat rotation. Nora was 24 years old. She had 3 years of production records and notebooks on the shelf above the farm office desk, records that included soil temperature measurements, tiller counts, disease scouting notes, yield tickets, and photographs with dates on the back. She had built something with those records that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with evidence. She had also been talking to people, not loudly, in the way of someone who has something that works and answers questions when asked. Gus Mercer had asked in July of 1989, and she had sent him the extension citations. Roy Phelps called in the fall of 1990 after seeing the Briggs wheat harvest numbers at the elevator. She sent him the same package she had sent Gus, plus her own 3-year production summary. 2 farmers from the north end of the county drove out in spring of 1991 to look at the fields. She answered all of them from the notebook. She never told anyone this was the future. She told them what the numbers showed on her specific ground with her specific variety at her specific seeding rate. She let them work out the implications themselves. Boyd Harker heard about these conversations. In a county of 16,000 people where the co-op was the center of agricultural commerce, information moved. By fall of 1991, he knew that at least 4 farmers had received production records from the Briggs farm and that 2 of them had planted winter wheat for the first time that September. He had also been watching what had happened to his own record. In 1987, he had recommended an Agricor hybrid corn to every farmer who asked his opinion. The May frost of 1989 was not his fault. No agronomist could have predicted the timing and severity of that event. But 3 of the farms he had advised to sign the Agricor exclusive contract had been locked into corn on the same low acres that froze. He had told them the contract was a reasonable arrangement. He had told them diversification was impractical at their scale. He had been wrong in a way that cost people money they could not recover. A man who has been certain for 22 years does not say this out loud. Certainty, once it has cost people something real, does not simply return. It has to be rebuilt from something more honest than habit. He drove out to the Briggs farm on a Thursday afternoon in October 1991. He parked in the driveway and stood for a moment looking at the fields, the specific look of a man who has been thinking about a place before arriving at it. Nora was in the machine shed. She heard the truck and came out with a rag in her hand. "Boyd," she said. He said her name. He looked at the Southwest 40, now in its 4th year of rotation. New seedlings already green in the afternoon light. He stood there looking at that field for a moment. "I have 4 farmers asking me about winter wheat," he said. "After the drought, after last year's numbers, they want to know if it makes sense for ground like theirs." Nora looked at him steadily. "You told me it did not make sense for ground like mine," she said, September of 1988. "You said this was corn country." He met her eyes and held them. To his credit, he did not look away. "I did say that," he said. She said, "The frost in May of 1989 did not hit randomly. It hit the low ground, the poorly drained ground, the ground that farmers in this county have been forcing corn onto for 40 years because corn is what we do here. The drought in 1990 hit shallow-rooted crops first. Those are not flukes. Those are patterns. I have 38 years of weather data from the Iowa State Archive and 3 years of my own field records, and they tell the same story. Any farm growing only one thing needs only one bad year to fail. That is not a wheat argument. That is a risk argument. And you have been giving risk advice in this county for 22 years. Boyd had his hands in his jacket pockets. His eyes stayed on the field. She said, "Come back Thursday. I will have something printed for you to take to those 4 farmers." He came back Thursday. She handed him 6 pages, 3 years of field-level production data organized by year and ground type, the extension citations from Iowa State and Minnesota, a comparison table showing per-acre revenue on the Southwest 40 under corn versus wheat across 5 years, and a 1-page explanation of the rotation structure, all typed on the farm office typewriter the night before. He read it in the truck in the driveway. Then he came back to the door. "Can I make a copy of this?" he said. "Take it," she said. "I have the originals." She watched his truck move down the county road in the long October light. Then she went inside and wrote in the notebook. Boyd Harker came. He took the summary. Thursday, October 17th, 1991. She did not write anything else about it. That winter, Boyd Harker recommended winter wheat to 7 farmers in Hardin County. He cited the extension literature. He cited the drought resilience data from 1990. He cited without attribution the production results from a farm in the county that had been running the system for 3 years. He did not say Nora's name. But the 7 farmers asked where the idea had come from, the way farmers always ask, and he told them, and they drove out to the Briggs farm and talked to her. And she talked to them from the notebook with the same specificity she had brought to the kitchen table in August of 1988. By fall of 1992, 14 farms in Hardin County had planted winter wheat for the first time. The Iowa State Extension Service sent a field agronomist named Patricia Holst to the county in early 1993 to compile data for a management guide on small grain production in north-central Iowa. Boyd Harker gave her Nora's name without being asked twice. Holst drove out to the Briggs farm and spent 4 hours with Nora and the notebooks. She examined the photographs and the yield tickets and the field maps and asked careful questions, the kind that come from someone genuinely trying to understand rather than confirm what they already believe. When she left, she said, "This is going to be in the guide." Nora said, "Use whatever is useful." She closed the notebook, put it back on the shelf, and went to check the new seedings on the creek bottom ground, which were now in their 2nd year and showing exactly the improvement in organic matter the data had suggested they would. The Iowa State Extension Service scheduled a small grains conference for January of 1993 in Ames. Nora was asked to present. She agreed without hesitation. She spent 2 evenings preparing charts by hand on graph paper from the farm office supply drawer, plotting her yield data by field and year in the format she had learned in Rourke's class, legible to people who were not already familiar with what she had built. She drove to Ames in the farm's Chevy Suburban with 3 years of updated notebooks on the back seat and the charts rolled in a cardboard tube. The conference room held 63 farmers and extension agents. She had not expected that many. She set the notebooks on the table at the front of the room and looked up. In the back row, in a metal folding chair, wearing his good flannel shirt with his hands on his knees, was Earl Briggs. He had not told her he was coming. He had simply driven to Ames and taken a seat the way he always attended things that mattered to him, quietly and without announcement. She did not stop. She began from the first notebook and moved through the data with precision and without apology, letting the numbers speak in the order she had built them to speak. She showed the yield comparison on the Southwest 40 across 7 years. She showed the frost data from May 1989. She showed the drought performance from 1990 and the soil organic matter progression on the creek bottom ground over 3 cycles. She showed the per-acre revenue comparison and the reduction in income variance, the year-to-year swing that kills farms not through single disasters, but through accumulated uncertainty, which she had reduced by building an operation that did not depend on one crop surviving one kind of year. The room asked questions, good ones, the kind that come from people genuinely trying to understand. She answered every one of them from the notebooks, from 3 years of walking fields and writing things down and needing no one to believe her while she was doing it. When the last question was answered, the room began to move, and in that movement there was sound, and the sound was applause. She looked to the back row. Earl Briggs was standing. He had stood when the room stood. He was not a man who clapped, and he was not clapping, but he was standing in the way that a man stands when he intends to be seen standing, when the standing is the whole of what he wants to say. She walked back through the crowd to where he was. He looked at her with the full weight of his attention. Then he said, "Your grandmother would have wanted to hear that." She had not expected that. She had expected nothing, which was what Earl Briggs usually offered, and which was usually enough. But she had not expected that. She said, "I know." She said it without theater and without decoration. They drove home separately on the same road, and between them was not silence and not distance, but the particular kind of space that opens between two people when the thing they have been building toward has finally been seen by enough other people that it no longer needs defending. The years that followed were not quiet. They were years of work that does not announce itself. The rotation expanded. The records accumulated. The notebooks multiplied on the shelf, each one labeled on the spine with the year and the field designation in Nora's precise, unhurried handwriting. By 1995, she had 9 notebooks on that shelf. By 1997, she had 11. Earl retired in the spring of 1997. He did not make an announcement. He came in from the field one April evening, set his work gloves on the bench by the back door, and said to Nora, who was at the desk going over seed orders, that he thought it was time she took the operation forward herself. She looked up from the desk. She said, "All right." He nodded once and went to wash his hands for supper. That simply and that completely. He handed her 620 acres and 31 years of accumulated practice and walked away from the daily weight of it without ceremony. He still came out to the field sometimes, in the evenings or on slow mornings. He would stand at a field edge and look at the crop with the careful inventory-taking attention of a man who had done this work long enough to know what he was looking at. But the decisions were hers now, and he left them there. He came the way a person comes back to something they built, to see what it has become in other hands. May was still in the house. She kept her garden. She kept the kitchen the way it had always been kept. On the shelf above her desk in the corner of the kitchen sat a composition notebook of her own, smaller than Nora's field notebooks, with a cover the color of old moss. She had been writing in it since before Nora was born. Nora had never read it, and it was never offered. Some things belonged to the person who kept them. Ray Holden had married Nora in the spring of 1992. A quiet ceremony at the county courthouse with Earl and May and Gus Mercer as witnesses. Ray farmed the 80 acres his own father had left him on the north side of the county road, a modest operation he ran with the same steadiness he brought to everything. He had understood from the first season he spent near Nora that there were 2 ways to be useful in a marriage with a woman like her. You could try to match what she was doing, or you could do your own work well and be present without crowding. Ray had chosen the second way, and it had been the right choice. He was in the north field when Willa pulled into the driveway in March of 2009, and he had seen the backpack and the notebook from 50 yards away and had not come inside. He understood what that combination of objects meant in this house, and he knew his wife would handle it the way she handled everything. Correctly and without needing an audience. Boyd Harker retired from the Hardin County Co-op in the spring of 1998, 29 years after he had started. The co-op held a gathering on a Friday afternoon in April, modest and genuine, coffee and sheet cake in the back room and a card signed by the staff and a few longtime farmer customers. Nora went because she was not someone who carried a grievance past its useful life, and because Boyd Harker, whatever he had been in September of 1988, had spent 7 years recommending a system to farmers in that county that had made them more resilient. That mattered more than the laugh. She stood toward the back of the room and listened to the short speeches. The co-op manager said Boyd had been the steady center of the operation for 3 decades. A couple of farmers said things that were kind and accurate about the advice he had given over the years. Boyd stood at the front of the room holding a piece of cake he did not eat and received the words with the look of a man whose thoughts were somewhere else. When he spoke, he thanked the staff and the farmers and said something about the privilege of spending a working life in a place where the work mattered. Then he said, without looking at anyone in particular, that the best thing he had done in the last decade at the co-op was learn to listen to people who knew things he did not. He did not say her name. He did not need to. The farmers in that room who had driven out to the Briggs place between 1991 and 1993 knew exactly who he meant. Gus Mercer, standing 2 feet from Nora with his own coffee, looked at her sideways. She looked at her cup. She did not smile at another person's reckoning. She never had. She drove home and wrote in the notebook, Boyd Harker's retirement gathering, April 24th, 1998. Nothing else. It did not need more than the date and the fact. By 1997, the winter wheat rotation covered 240 acres of the Briggs farm. The Southwest 40 that Nora had first drilled in September of 1988 had become, through 9 years of continuous rotation, the highest performing ground on the property measured by per-acre revenue. The deep wheat roots had broken through the clay pan that had limited corn yields on that ground for decades. The soil organic matter had increased measurably. The drainage had improved through the biological work of root systems reaching where tile could not. By 1997, that 40 acres was yielding corn at 151 bushels per acre in its corn years. In 1988, it had yielded 114. The revenue variance of the farm, the year-to-year income swing that kills operations not through single disasters but through accumulated unpredictability, dropped by 29% over the decade following full rotation expansion. Nora calculated this across 10 years of records and wrote it in the 2001 notebook with the same matter-of-fact precision she gave every number. It was not something she shared widely. It was something she kept because it was true. And truth required documentation even when no one was asking to see it. The years between 1993 and 2009 are the years of a farm that has found its way. They do not have the drama of the early years. They have instead the quieter substance of a well-designed system doing what it was designed to do, season after season, when you have been patient enough to give it time to work. Earl was 73 in 2009. He had aged the way men age who have worked outside all their lives, with the weathering of a face that has spent decades reading the same sky. He still came out to the fields. He walked more slowly than he once had and said less than he ever had, which was not much to begin with. And the silence meant the same thing it had always meant. He was looking, and he was satisfied with what he saw. May was 71. Her garden was smaller than it had been, but she kept it. The composition notebook on her kitchen desk had been replaced twice over the years, and the old one sat in the storage room, stacked on the same shelf where the tin box still lived behind the milk crates. In March of 2009, Willa came home from Iowa State. Nora's daughter was 19 years old, finishing her first year of a soil science degree at the same university where Nora had studied agronomy 23 years earlier. She had Earl's way of moving through a space, deliberate and without wasted motion. She had May's eyes, watchful and patient, and capable of taking in more than they appeared to. She had grown up on this farm, which meant she had grown up watching her mother walk fields with a notebook and ask questions of the soil that took years to answer. She had chosen soil science not because anyone suggested it, but because she had grown up in a house where the science of soil was treated as the most serious subject in the world, more serious than money and more serious than weather, because it was the thing that made both money and weather mean something or not mean something. She came home for spring break with a backpack, a notebook from the campus bookstore, and a proposal she had spent 3 weeks writing. Nora was at the farm office desk when Willa walked in and set the papers down. Not dramatically, just set them there. The way you set something down when you are confident it can stand on its own. Nora looked at the top sheet and knew within 5 seconds what she was looking at. Cover crops. Not as a trial, not as a single field test, as a full system integration across the rotation. Cereal rye and hairy vetch drilled into standing corn at the V5 stage, a method documented in trials from Wisconsin and southern Minnesota, terminated in spring before the wheat planting window, suppressing weeds without herbicide, building nitrogen through vetch fixation, reducing the farm's fertilizer application by an amount Willa had calculated from 3 different trial data sets and expressed as both pounds of nitrogen per acre and dollars per acre at current input prices. The soil organic matter projections over 5 years matched and in some cases exceeded the improvements Nora had measured from the wheat rotation alone. The citations ran to the University of Wisconsin Extension Service, the Rodale Institute, and a peer-reviewed paper from the journal Agronomy that Willa had printed at the campus library and annotated in pencil in the margins. The comparison farm data came from a producer in Ringgold County who had been running the system for 4 years and whom Willa had called on the telephone and interviewed for 35 minutes, transcribing the yield records into a table on page 3. Nora read the first page. She read the comparison table. She looked at the nitrogen credit calculation. She set the papers down. She looked at her daughter. "Yes," she said. Willa looked back at her. "That is it. Your numbers are right," Nora said. "Your citations are current. Your comparison farm is comparable ground. You called the producer yourself instead of borrowing someone else's summary. What else do you need from me? I thought you would want more time." "I had 20 years," Nora said. "You do not need my time. You need the ground." She slid the papers back across the desk. Then she stood and walked to the window that looked out over the fields. The March light was thin gold, the kind that does not warm anything yet, but suggests warmth is coming and means it. She was 42 years old. She had been working this ground in some capacity since she was 12, and in full capacity since she was 21. She had 620 acres of soil. She understood the way a person understands a language they have spoken their entire lives. Every low spot and every shelf of compressed clay and every place where the organic matter ran deep and where it did not. And she was about to hand all of it to a 19-year-old who had come home with a notebook and data and the kind of patience that shows itself not in waiting, but in having the answer ready before anyone has finished deciding to ask. She turned around. "All 620, she said. "Not 40 to try something. All of it." Willa looked at her steadily. "That is a lot of ground to experiment on." "It is not an experiment," Nora said. "Your data says it works. The ground will confirm it. I am not interested in watching you prove it on 40 acres for 3 years while the rest of the farm waits." Willa picked up her notebook. "I will need to talk to the cover crop seed supplier about timing. Gus, Mercer's son, runs the operation now." Nora said, "He has been using cereal rye on his east side for 2 years. Call him first. He will tell you what he learned the hard way so you do not have to." Willa wrote it down in the same unhurried handwriting that Nora used and that May used. The handwriting of people who understand that what you put on paper is the only version of a thing that survives the years unchanged. She left the office to find the phone. Nora stood at the window after she left. Outside, the Southwest 40 was visible from this angle. The same 40 acres she had first drilled in September of 1988. It was bare now, resting after the last harvest, the way ground rests when it is being asked to change again. She thought about the first notebook on the shelf, the one with May's handwriting on the first page. She had found it in the spring of 1993, the week after the Ames conference, when she pulled it off the shelf to update the comparison table she was building for Patricia Holst's extension guide. She had opened the cover and seen handwriting that was not hers and understood within 3 seconds who had put it there and when. May's handwriting. Careful and even. dated August 14th, 1988. 3 weeks before Nora came home from Iowa State, 3 weeks before the papers went on the kitchen table, before any of it. May had copied the sentence from the letter Nora had written home in the spring of 1986, the letter describing Rourke's classroom and the thing he had written on the blackboard. She had written it out in full, and below it, in the same careful hand, a single line, not addressed to anyone, not signed, just set down on the page the way something is written when a person has been thinking it long enough that it needs to be made real. She already knows this. Give her the ground. Nora had stood in this farm office holding that notebook for a long time. Then she had put it back on the shelf and gone to the kitchen. May was at the counter, the notebook. Nora said, "The first page." May turned around with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else. "I wondered when you would find it," May said. "So, how long did you know?" "Since your second letter home from Ames, the one where you described Rourke's class. I knew what you were going to do before you knew you were going to do it." Nora stood in the doorway for a moment. "You put it there before I came home. I put it where you would find it when you needed to remember why you started." They had not spoken about it again. It had not needed more conversation than that. Some things are complete in the saying of them once. Nora walked to the shelf now and stood in front of the 43 notebooks lined up in the order they had been filled, one for each year since 1988. The early ones were soft with handling, their covers worn and spines cracked from being opened so many times. The middle ones were less touched now that the records inside had become history rather than active evidence. The recent ones were still stiff at the spine, still in use. The first one sat at the far left where it had always sat. The cover was faded. The corner was bent from years of being taken down and replaced. Inside, on the first page, in handwriting that was not hers, was the reason any of it had been possible. Not the data, not the extension citations or the yield tickets or the frost records or the comparison tables. A woman sitting at a kitchen table in August of 1988, reading a sentence her daughter had sent home in a letter, and understanding before anyone else did that this was not an idea someone was considering. It was a decision already made, and writing it down so that the ground would be given before the decision ever had to be explained. She put the notebook back in its place. Outside, Willa was on the phone. Nora could see her through the window, standing in the yard with the notebook open in her hand, writing something down, head bent over the page in the concentrated attention of someone listening carefully who does not intend to hear the same thing twice. May appeared in the doorway of the farm office. She looked at Nora and then out the window at Willa in the yard. "She is going to be something," May said. "She already is," Nora said. May looked out the window another moment. "You were 21 when you brought me those papers." Nora said, "I know." May said, "She is 19. She is." Nora did not answer. She was watching Willa in the yard, the notebook open in her hand. Her weight shifted slightly forward the way Nora stood when she was paying full attention to something. The March light had changed while they stood there, and the fields beyond the yard were beginning to show the first suggestion of the warmth that was coming, the stubble catching the afternoon sun at an angle that made it look, for a moment, like something that had already grown. May went back to the kitchen. Earl came around the corner of the machine shed in the distance, moving slowly with his hands in his jacket pockets. He stopped at the fence line of the Southwest 40 and stood there looking at the ground. The same ground he had stood over in May of 1989 and looked at wheat that did not care about 23 degrees. He stood there a long while. Then he looked toward the house, toward the window where Nora was standing, and she raised her hand once. He raised his in return. Then he turned back to the field. Nora left the office and walked to the kitchen. She sat at the table where it had all started. The same table, the same chairs, the same window, looking southwest. And she opened a new notebook to the first page and wrote the date. March 14th, 2009. Below it, she wrote Willa's first proposal, cover crops, full rotation, all 620 acres, cereal rye and hairy vetch at V5. Nitrogen credit calculation 47 pounds per acre, $18.80 per acre at current input prices. Comparison farm, Ringgold County, 4 years of data. Citations, University of Wisconsin Extension, Rodale Institute, Agronomy Journal, Volume 94. She wrote it all down, every number, every source, every detail, because the record was the thing that outlasted everything else. Not the argument or the certainty or the moment in a conference room when someone finally stood up. Not the laugh at the co-op counter in September of 1988, or the frost that came in May of 1989, or the deed in a tin box that held against a company from Chicago. The record, the careful, patient, year-by-year accounting of what was true and when it was true and what it meant and what came next. She wrote until the coffee went cold. Outside, Willa was still on the phone, still writing. The March light had shifted while Nora sat there, and the fields to the southwest had moved from bare to gold, the way fields do when the afternoon sun catches the stubble at the right angle and makes it look, just for a moment, like something that has already grown. The notebook from 1988 sat on the shelf where it had always sat. First position, left side. 43 notebooks now, one for each year. The record of a farm that had been told it was wrong and had gone ahead and been right, written down in the careful handwriting of 3 women who understood that what you put on paper is the only version of a thing that does not change. The wheat had come back in April of 1989. It had come back every April since. It would come back next April too, and the April after that, rising from the same ground that everyone in the county had written off in the fall of 1988 and that nobody wrote off anymore. Nora closed the new notebook. She set it on the desk. Through the window, Willa was finishing her call, capping her pen, looking out across the fields with the particular focus of someone who has just been told something useful and is already thinking about what to do with it. The ground was hers now, all 620 acres of it, and the notebooks were on the shelf, waiting for what she would write.
When I was young, I chased the horizon. Certain peace was waiting there. I thought the storms were wrong turns taken, and every burden was unfair. So I spent years fighting the mountains, cursing every winding road, never seeing that the struggle was the thing that made me grow. The eagle learns within the wind, the oak grows strong beneath the snow, and every soul that's worth becoming must walk where harder paths may go. The road was never meant to be easy, the storm was never meant to pass. The waves were not there to stop me, they were there to teach me how to last. Every trial is part of the journey, every scar becomes a guide. The mountain is not in my way, the mountain is the reason for the climb. I've known loss that left me broken, I've known fear that stole my breath, I've known nights so cold and endless I could barely take one step. Yet every wound became a teacher, every failure left a mark, and every valley that I walked through placed another step. separate.